Hello guys and welcome to another video. Today we will be talking about some of the very basic king and pawn endgames. And of course we will start with probably the most important concept that you should all know about, of course, which is the opposition. Now the opposition means basically that both kings are standing opposed to each other with one square between them, and whichever side has made the last move basically has the opposition. Now in this example, it's white to move, which means that black has the opposition. That's why black can easily draw this in the game, simply because he can stop any entrance of the white king. For example, here he can always reply taking the opposition and stopping any entrance of the white king. Now the thing you need to know about this basic endgame is that if white wants to win, he must control one of these three key squares. If the white king sits on one of these three squares, the game is just lost. Whichever side has to move, it doesn't matter, white is winning. Now let's see what happens if it's black to move, which means that white has the opposition. Now the black king has to move and give way to the white king, which means that white will occupy this key square. Remember that we said that white has to occupy one of these three squares, and this basically guarantees the win. And now black doesn't have anything to do. After king d8, white just takes the opposition and this is lost. We can see clearly here that black is just lost because the pawn will just promote after the white king controls this square. And white just makes a new queen. Now let's look at another basic position that you should know. It's practically the same thing, except there is one small trap that you should know about so you can avoid it in your own games. Here it's white to move, which means that black has the opposition, but the opposition here doesn't mean anything, simply because, as we said before, white controls all these three squares, and the game is just lost, of course. Now here white goes king to a6, and after the black kings move to c7, now white just wins because he controls the promotion square. And similarly here, if black tries to get the opposition, he's just lost because we simply push our own pawn. And after king to b8, we push again, and black has to give way to the white king, and we control the promotion square, and we win the game. Now here there is a small detail that you should know. You shouldn't go king to c6. Simply here, because black has this move king to a7, and after you go king to c7, black goes king to e8, and now if you push your pawn, we can see clearly that this is a stalemate. We can see that the black king can't move all the squares to which he can move are controlled, and this is the stalemate. Now here, there is still one chance to save our win, because we can simply go king to b6 and transpose to our previous position. Now we go king to a6 and we simply repeated the position. So remember here, the way to win this endgame is to go king to a6. Remember that you shouldn't go king to c6 simply because of this stalemate trick. There is one exception to this rule that you should know about, which is the corner pawn. Now the fact that we are left with the corner pawn simply limits our option. The black king simply keeps shuffling between the g8 and h8 square, and simply there is nothing that we can do. For example, here after king to g6, king to g8, if we push our pawn, the king goes back to h8, and now if we push our pawn, this is simply stalemate, and if we go to f7, simply the pawn drops. Okay, so now let's try to put some of this information that we have just learned into practice. Now it's clear that we are trying to promote our own pawn, and the way to do it is to try to control one of these three key squares. So first, let's try to see what happens if we try to go for the closest one, which is the c6. Now after king to c2, king to e7, king to b3, king to d6. Now if we go c4, this is just a simple draw, since the black king will take the opposition, and there is nothing we can do. If we push our pawn, there is nothing to be done. Here again, black king will just keep taking the opposition each time. And the point here, if we push our pawn, this is just stalemate. And if we move our king, the pawn just drops. Okay, so now we have to try to do something different. So here simply we can go to c4, so the only thing left to do is to go to a4. After king to c5, king to a5. And the point here is that we are threatening to occupy the key square a6. So black must stop us, so after king to b7, now we simply take the opposition and we are simply winning. Because if the black king goes to a7, we simply control c6 square, and if the black king goes to c7, we simply control the a6 square. For example, here after king to a7, king to c6, here we are just winning. After king to c7, king to a8. The only thing that we should remember, of course, that we shouldn't push our pawn, because this is a simple stalemate that we talked about. So we have to go king to b6, and now we control the a6 square, and we are just winning. The pawn just promotes. Let's jump now to some of the more complicated examples, and this is actually a very interesting one. Here we are dealing with the case of doubled pawn. And this is a win end game, but it's a little bit tricky, so we have to be careful. For instance, here, if we try to go to c4, which is very natural, it's an immediate draw after king to b6. Our king has to move, and the pawn on b5 just drops, and this is an easy draw. So the winning move here is king to c3. And the point here is that after the king goes to b6, now we go to c4. And this is a team that we will talk about in future videos, which is called Zugzwang. And this simply means that the black king has to move, but there aren't any good moves that the black king can make. So after the black king moves, we simply enter with our king, taking the opposition and simply winning the game. So after the king moves, for example, to b7, we simply advance our pawn. And after king goes to a6, here we have to be a little bit careful, because if we push our king trying to control this key square, this is a simple stalemate. So we simply push our pawn to b7, sacrificing it. After the black king takes the pawn, we simply take the opposition and we win the game. So here black's best move is probably to go to c7. Now here the point is, if we go to c4 now, again black will reply with king to b6, and our king has to move and we simply lose the pawn. So here we go to d4, and after the black king moves, taking the opposition, now we go to c4. After the black king moves to c7, now we take the opposition with king to c5. And after the black king moves, now we push our pawn again. And we already saw that we meet this move by pushing our pawn, sacrificing it and gaining the opposition. Now let's see what happens if the black king goes to b8. Now of course we control this key square. And after the black king takes the opposition, we simply push our pawn. And after king to b8, now again we sacrifice our pawn by going king to c5. And after the black king takes, now we get the opposition and we win the game. A key point here to remember is that we have to go king to c5. For example, we are careless and we just go king to b5, the black king takes and gets the opposition, and this is simply a draw. Let's jump now into another example where black also has a pawn. Now obviously our goal is to win the black pawn and also end up with a position that is winning. And in order to attack the black pawn, there are two ways. We can go king to f2 or we can go king to g1. Let's first check what happens if we go king to g1. Here this doesn't work because the black king is in time to defend his pawn. For example, here after king to d7, we go king to h2, king to e6, king to h3, and after king to f5, black is in time to defend his pawn, and this is just a draw. So here we must go king to f2. And the point here is if black tries to do the same thing, we can win the black pawn, and black will end up with a position that is losing. For example, here after king to g7, we simply take the opposition and we are clearly winning. So here black has to try something else. And a very clever idea that black can try is to go pawn to h4. And the point here is that he is controlling this square, so we can't simply use the g3 square to attack the pawn. So we have again two options, either king to f3 or king to g1. If we go king to f3, this simply doesn't work. because black can push his pawn. And the point here, if we take this pawn, black is in time to control the h8 square, and we are left with a corner pawn, and this is a simple draw. For example, here, the black king can get to the h8 square, and we are simply not gonna win this endgame. And similarly here, if we try to go g4 in order to use the g3 square to attack the black pawn, of course the black pawn will fall, but the black king is in time to get the opposition, and we will end up with a position that is drawn. For example, here king to g3, and we simply take the pawn, but we are left with a position that is drawn. Now black takes the opposition, and this is a simple draw. So simply here, king to f3 doesn't work, so we have to try something else. And the only thing left is to go king to g1. At first glance, this might look weird because we went to f2 and then we came back to g1. It looks like we've been wasting time. But the key difference here between this position and the previous one is that the pawn was on h5. And here the pawn is on h4, which means that the pawn now is closer to our king, and we can simply pick it, and we will end up with a winning position. For example, here, if black tries to defend his pawn by going king to d7, we are simply in time to win the pawn, and we will end up with a position that is winning. So black here has to go again h3, trying to exchange the pawns, but we simply don't allow this, and we go g3. And the point here is that we are attacking the pawn via the h2 square. So if black tries to come closer after king to d7, king to h2, we take the pawn, and now we are in time to get the opposition, and we will win the game. For example, here it's a clear win. We will control the promotion square, and this is just winning. So let's just go through the winning procedure again. We have to go king to f2. After the pawn pushes, we go again king to g1. After h3, we go g3. And it's very important here to go g3, because if you go simply g4, this is simple draw, because after we pick up the pawn, now we are not in time to control the key squares in front of the pawn, because the black king will just come and take the opposition, and this is a simple draw. After we push our pawn, black king goes, now it's just a draw after black takes the opposition. So here we go g3. And the point here is that now that the pawn is not pushed to g4, the key squares are now h4, g4, and f4. And we are in time to win the black pawn and place our king on the h4 square, and we simply win the game. For example, here, we just pick up the pawn, and now after h4, we just take the opposition, and we just controlled one of the key squares in front of the pawn, and we are just winning. For example, here, it's a clear one. We just keep pushing our pawn, and after we control the promotion square, we are just winning. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Please don't hesitate to tell us in the comments what sort of videos you would like to see in the future. And thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.